We're here to remember the Alamo, and Goliad, I guess, to a lesser extent. The Alamo, 13 Days of Glory, a mission that's basically become the Taj Mahal of Texas. First and foremost, is located in modern-day San Antonio, known at the time as San Antonio de Bejar. So, Texas was part of Mexico, but an influx of settlers, predominantly from the U.S., was making things difficult. Add to this what was going on in Mexican politics, and you should know by now that if I mention Mexican and politics in the same sentence, we're talking about
Santa Ana.
Yep, guess who was president of Mexico? Santa Anna, who still had both legs and had yet to aid in the creation of chiclets. See, he had been elected president, but didn't really want to be president outside of the title, so he had this guy, Valentin Farias, in charge of the government as vice president and stayed at his villa in Veracruz. Farias enacted quite a few policies considered liberal, aka they went against the rich and or the church, which Santa Anna privately supported, but publicly, when people weren't fans of these changes, he denounced them and the vice president resigned. And at that point, Santa Anna said, screw it, I'm just going to start my own government with blackjack and hookers. By abolishing the Constitution and pretty much declaring himself a dictator, he caused a lot of issues in many Mexican states, including Coahuila y Texas. And so he went about putting them back in line, which is what brought him eventually to Texas. Now, the Texians, a mixture of natives, Mexican, and American settlers, plus more than a handful of runaway slaves, had become more and more independently minded, we'll say, and they really did not want to be part of what Santa Anna was selling. So they had themselves a Texas Revolution, and the first step of said revolution was to force Mexican troops out, which they did. And since it was abandoned, a garrison of Texians took over residency in the Alamo, which means poplar or cottonwood, by the way, and had started as a missionary school to teach converted natives, before being itself converted into a fortification by the Mexican army. So Santa Anna was coming with about 1,500 men, and considering the garrison was at most a few hundred, reinforcements were called for. Instead, Jim Bowie was sent with a small force to remove all the armaments of the fort and destroy it, but he was convinced to do otherwise when he arrived. The commander of the fort, James Neal, set out to gain reinforcements again, leaving 2 men in charge. The leader of the Texian troops was Lieutenant Colonel William Travis. The leader of the militia was Jim Bowie, known for his knife and the sandbar fight, where he was shot twice, stabbed twice, once by a sword cane. Yeah, you heard that right. And he killed the man that had stabbed him with said sword cane by stabbing him with his Bowie knife as the man attempted to pull the sword cane out of Bowie's chest. To say the man was respected is an understatement. And of course, there's one more guy kind of famous for the Alamo. This guy.
Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier.
Hey, it's the only proper way to introduce him. Yep, Davy Crockett, frontiersman, congressman from Tennessee. He was even played by John Wayne. He has that in common with Genghis Khan. And come on now, let's use a more appropriate picture. Okay, that's closer. There you go. Crockett was popular with, well, pretty much everybody, so when he arrived on February 8th, it greatly lifted the men's spirit. However, Santa Anna arrived with his force on February 23rd, beginning their 13-day siege. By the way, 1836 was a leap year. Something important to add here, Santa Anna had proclaimed the Texians were not enemy combatants who you were supposed to take as prisoners of war, but rather pirates who you just executed on the spot. This became important. Now, both sides were reaching out for reinforcements. The Texians gained a few here and there, their numbers ending up around 260, whereas several groups of Mexican reinforcements arrived, bolstering Santa Anna's numbers to about 3,100. A detachment of over 300 men under James Fannin headed out for the Alamo, but turned back only a mile into the trip. We'll get back to these guys. So the two sides skirmished here and there, attempted to negotiate a peace, but given that the Mexican army had raised a flag of no quarter, that kind of put a dampener on things. It should also be added that during this time, Bowie became so sick that he was bedridden. We're not completely sure what the issue was, but it was probably either pneumonia or tuberculosis. After several days of firing artillery at each other, both sides knew an assault was coming, and it was at this point that the supposed line in the sand occurred, where Travis admitted that they were probably all going to die in the attack, and he drew a line in the dirt, calling on the men to decide whether to stay or leave. According to reports that honestly most historians question, only one man chose not to cross, Bowie being carried across in his bed. Again, might have happened, might not have. What we do know happened was on the night of March 5th, Mexico stopped about firing. Santa Anna was a smart man. He planned to attack the next morning and knew that the Texians would take this period of silence to finally get some sleep, and that's exactly what they did. And so, with cavalry encircling the fort to halt any escapes, Mexican troops were able to sneak up and kill the 3 men on watch before attacking the fort. The Texians were able to fight off this first assault, losing Colonel Travis, who was killed defending a wall from Mexican troops attempting to climb into the fort. A second assault was also fought back, however the third attack was able to scale the northern wall, causing the Texians to concentrate on that area and allowing Mexican troops to enter through other areas. It's like a boat. When water starts pouring in, it's pretty much sunk. Eventually, the Texian forces remaining barricaded themselves into the barracks and the chapel. A few groups attempting to flee from the fort were killed by the Mexican cavalry, and a small group of Texians, led by Davy Crockett, were the last Texians out in the open. We don't know how Crockett died, but we do know that he and his group were down to hand-to-hand combat, and yes, that pose right there is historically accurate. His rifle was named Old Betsy, by the way. More likely than not, they were overrun and killed. Jim Bowie's death is also a mystery. Most historians agree he died in his bed, gun in one hand, knife in the other. We know he went down, but we're pretty sure he went down swinging. As his mother remarked when she heard of his death, "I'll wager no wounds were found on his back." The Texians were eventually all killed, Mexican troops using the Texians' own cannons to blow open doors and swarm into rooms, killing everyone inside. All dead Texians throughout the fort were bayoneted to ensure death, and the troops looted any and all that they could. The Texian bodies were gathered and burned. It should be added that the women and children, with one accidental exception, were not harmed. And because it bears mentioning, there was the massacre at Goliad later that same month, where over 400 Texians that surrendered were executed. Yeah, that whole pirate thing again, and yeah, these were those same guys under Fannin, who was also executed at Goliad, that had turned back from aiding the Alamo. Santa Anna intended for the tactic to frighten the Texians into surrender, but yeah, it had the exact opposite effect. The Texians didn't get scared, they got mad. We're talking Japanese pissed off at whales and dolphins mad. And this anger fueled the war effort, eventually culminating with the capture of Santa Anna at San Jacinto and El Presidente signing over Texas as independent. Oh, and one final little fun fact here, supporters of Santa Anna were known as Santanistas. Sorry, I just had to add that.